Alright, in this video I'm going to show you how I would build a brand new Bretonnian army in 2024 for an escalation league, which means I start at 500 points, grow it to 1,000, 1,500, and finally 2,000. So in the first part of this video, I'll go over my list at each stage, why I picked the things I did, and how the list plays. Then afterwards, I'm going to show you a hyper competitive list I built from scratch for 2,000 points if you're interested in that as well. Finally, at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about sourcing these miniatures, unit fillers and stuff like that might save you a little bit of money. I should also mention that we're building a grand army of Bretonnia here, but if people like it, maybe I'll go back and do an errantry list or even an outcast list. But without further ado, here's my 500 point grand Bretonnian army list. If you've played around in the older versions of Warhammer Fantasy, you might be aware that at 500 points, Bretonnia was absolutely terrible and maybe even not possible. In previous editions, a Bretonnia army had to have a BSB, a battle standard bearer, and at 500 points, it made it very tricky to get a legal list together. That problem doesn't exist in this edition, but we are still a mess at 500 points. Per the rules, a Baron is not allowed in a 500 point game. You must have at least an army of 1,000 points to have a Baron. We are allowed to take a Duke in a 500 point games, but the unit itself is so expensive that it's hard to justify, especially if you can't put him on a Pegasus. And to put him on a Pegasus on a 500 point game would really be a that guy move. So we are left the options of a Paladin or a Damsel to be our general. And a mounted paladin would be an absolutely fine choice here, especially if you're just starting out and maybe the only thing you had is the original army box. It's a pretty big investment. I get it. You might not want to buy another unit so soon, so you could use a mounted paladin here instead of the damsel I used. However, I like the damsel here because for the point value, she can do much more than a paladin can at this point. Plus, even though you'll have to buy this extra if you bought the big box, you're going to have to buy one anyways. Damsels are your only spellcasting unit, and magic is important in the old world. I opted to take illusion for allure magic in this case because this is how I run damsels in larger games. I make them buff machines for my knights. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm making her illusion. I'm making sure she has the spell Wrath of the Lady as well. And I'm going to use her to buff up my knights to mow down anything else at 500 points. Battle magic would be a good choice here as well. That's just not how I play damsels. The list plays pretty straightforward at this point. In fact, most Bretonnian lists play pretty straightforward. At 500 points, 20 peasant bowmen are actually quite threatening, and so your opponent will have to deal with these or slowly be whittled down. You want to use your men-at-arms to push into combat, and then if you can, you want to side charge with your knights. And try to use them in a way that keeps your opponent from getting to your archers. And the damsel we're going to attach to our knights and let her spend her time buffing them. Our buffed up knight should be able to take on anything you should reasonably encounter at 500 points. And the idea is that this will give you the basics of how to play Bretonnia as you expand your army. Positioning of your knights, using magic to buff your knights, and chipping away with peasants and bogging things down with peasants. These are all skills you'll use through all lists up to 2,000 points and probably with any list you make with Bretonnia going forward. In other words, this list is great as a starting point if you're new to the game or if you're just knocking some rust off. But I will admit, after a game or two, this 500 point list will seem kind of boring. But stick with me because at 1,000 points, this list starts to get kind of interesting and very fun. As far as new units and new models, we are adding Pegasus Knights and we are adding the Baron, Duke, or Paladin model, whatever you want to call them. But other than that, you should have everything painted already. While we didn't add a lot of new units per se, we have drastically changed how this list plays. Our damsel has gotten a big upgrade and she's now a level 4 wizard and a prophetess. And there's a trade-off here, right? We got the level 4 wizard, but that means we probably couldn't fit a Duke or a Baron. And the reason I did that is just because the way the rules work this edition with magic, if you want to use it at all, it's either go level 4 or don't bother. So we are sacrificing the opportunity cost of having a Baron or Duke here for our level 4 Prophetess, but we're going to make up for that because we're going to give her an Ogre Blade, and then we're going to use an Arcane Familiar to make sure she has Spectral Doppelganger. This combination will make your Prophetess an absolute beast in combat and is likely to catch your opponent by surprise, especially if they're new to this game like you. But she can also still help buff your knights. So we don't have enough points for our Duke or even a Baron, but we can afford a Paladin, and you're probably going to use the same model here anyways. We're also going to put this Paladin onto a Pegasus so he's extra mobile. Even if we could afford a Duke at this level at 1,000 points, I don't think that's the right play. I do think it's kind of too strong for this 1,000 point level, and it kind of goes against the spirit of what an escalation league is. But that's just my opinion. I don't think you're going to run into the same issues with a Paladin per se. As I currently have this Paladin kitted out, he works great as a monster hunter. In case your opponent starts to bring out one of their big models at this point level, this Paladin should be able to take care of them. And if not that, you can use them to hunt down ranged units, artillery, or just use him as a force multiplier for your Pegasus Knights. I gave him a rampaging banner to ensure he makes his own charges, and if applicable, when he's close enough, he can help your other knights make their charges too, which is very important for Bretonnia, but this is just a preference thing. Feel free to experiment with other banners. Especially as you get more familiar with the game and know when to charge and when not to charge, you might find other banners like the War Banner more useful. Your Knights of the Realm will continue to be the bust for your damsel. The peasant bowmans will just take chip shots here and there, and the main use for the men-at-arms is to try to bog down a unit for you to make charge at, or bog down a unit you don't want near your knights. If you can tie up something expensive with your men-at-arms for a turn or two, consider it a win. These Pegasus Knights are probably the best overall unit out of the Bretonnian book, and probably have a case to be one of the better units in the game overall. They're both killy and very mobile, making them a great all-around unit. In this case, we want to first use them to take down threats like artillery and ranged, and then find something that you need to kill and destroy it with, a rear or flank charge. This list should be a lot of fun for you and a real handful for your opponent. There are just a lot of different threats that are very mobile that your opponent will have to deal with only having 1,000 points to make his moves. This list wants to be fast and it wants to hit hard on the charge, and I think that is the essence of Bretonnia and what makes them fun. If Bretonnia is for you, you should start enjoying the list at this point. And hopefully you do, because at 1,500 points, we're taking basically the same strategy, but just adding more power to it. I'm choosing to keep the Prophetess the exact same as in the previous list, to where she is the lore of illusion. She still has some ability to help out our knights, but she'd also be a beat stick. If you want to change this, feel free, have some experimentation, have some fun, make it yours. Paladin in the previous list is getting a big promotion and is now a Duke. I'm giving him the Bedazzling Helm to make him a little bit more durable because he's going to draw a lot of pressure, and we also given him the Falcon Horn so he can help disrupt enemy plans. It is my opinion that the Falcon Horn is one of the best magical items in the game. It absolutely disrupts your opponent if they're bringing any flyers at all. That being said, it is a niche item, and so if you are expecting to not face flyers, you might want to replace that with something else. Knights of the Realm are a solid unit all around. You're never going to regret having them around. We are adding another 7 to our list and keeping the men-at-arms and peasant archers relatively the same. Truth be told, if this wasn't an escalation list and if I could build it raw, I wouldn't have men-at-arms at all. I would just bring peasant archers here. Peasant archers will always have a niche spot, being basically harassing and helping us pick off a little bit of units. Men-at-arms kind of lose their value as lists get bigger and your armies get faster, and they just can't keep pace with your knights, and their use just kind of falls off, in my opinion. We are also going to bring some Grail Knights into this list. I am going to make the assumption that if you're starting a Bretonnian army, you're really excited about Grail Knights. They're like the pinnacle of the lore. They're really cool. They're a good unit. I'm not necessarily sure they're the best unit or to have a place in a really competitive list, but I think it's great for an escalation league. I think you'll have a lot of fun with them, and when they charge hard. The overall strategy of this list is relatively unchanged. We're going to use our Duke, our Grail Knights, and our Knights of the Realm as our hammers. We're going to hopefully use the men-at-arms as a bit of an anvil, and we're going to try to get in as many side charges, rear charges, and combo charges as humanly possible. We will embed our damsel with one of our knight units. I would probably start with the Grail Knights, but maybe it might work better in the Knight of the Realms just because they might need her help a little bit more than your Grail Knights do. Maybe do some experimenting with that and change things depending on how you play. But now that we have more knights moving around, we should have more options for getting, favorable charges, and it should be easier to charge multiple units, one unit, which is very, very devastating. So this list should be fairly strong and also fairly fluffy and loreful, and should encompass about what you expect from Bretonnia. Some of you might want to run more peasants, and by all means modify the list to accompany that, but I think the majority of you are going to want a knight focused list like this one. And hopefully you'll like it even more so as you bring this up to 2,000 points. The goal of our 2,000 point list is actually less about adding power to this list because it probably already has plenty. We're going to look to add more unit diversity and add more phases of the game because this is for escalation, and that's what escalation is all about, is learning the units and learning the game. So with that philosophy in mind, here's my 2,000 point list. For this list, for a prophetess, we are removing the Ogre Blade combo. Our list is plenty killy, we just don't need this assistance anymore, and the points are better spent elsewhere. Instead, her role is now fully a buff bot. She has the default spell from Lore of Illusion, and we're also going to give her Wrath of the Lady so she can buff her knight, and then we're going to enhance her a little bit with the prayer icon, and that's going to help her expand her dispel and make the lives of your enemy spellcasters even harder. Our Duke remains largely the same, except now he has the virtue of heroism. He is a deadly monster hunter. He is deadly in general. You're going to see a build just like this Duke as long as the Old World exists, because this is one of the most efficient units on the tabletop. You'll see it if you play against Bretts, you'll use it a lot if you play Bretts. It's just the way you roll with the Duke. Feel free to play around with it, but this build I have right here will be solid in both casual list and hyper competitive lists. And then we're going to add an additional paladin on Pegasus here, and we're going to use him as a force multiplier. He is not as strong individually as the Duke. We want our Duke to be a monster hunter. We want our Duke to make the charges. We want this paladin on Pegasus to be assisting other knights in their charges, and that's partially why we give him the war banner and help improve our combat all around. The addition of the paladin in this 2,000 point list does make this list pretty top heavy, but that's pretty normal for this edition. Warhammer the Old World is very much hero hammer, with cavalry and large monstrous units being guest stars. Our core units are actually a little bit trimmed down than they were in the last list. We're basically trying to get just to our 500 point minimum that we need for this army. Our Knights of the Realm are solid, especially if they get a little bit of support from the Prophetess or from the Paladin on Pegasus. Then we have the Peasant Bowmen that can harass a little bit, and then we have our Men-at-Arms that can hopefully tie a unit down in a blob so we can get a side or rear charge off. The Pegasus Knights are the best knights overall in the entire list, so we're adding a couple more to them. We're going up to 5, and it's going to help it be more of a force to deal with. Keeping in mind that this unit has 2 wounds apiece, so adding 2 more bodies is really 4 more wounds, which is really nice. And then for a new unit here, we're bringing in the Questing Knights. I think Questing Knights are great for a casual escalation league. They're flavorful. I think if you're into Bretonnia, you have to be super excited by the concept of the Questing Knight. It's such a badass ideal. But I think on the tabletop, they don't really have a well-defined role. It's not that they're bad per se, they just don't bring anything that we probably can get from a different unit on the list for more point efficiency. But we are using them in this list. We're going to take advantage of their fearless nature, and we're going to take advantage of their great weapons, and they're going to be really great for high armor targets. As long as they can survive that initial round, they're going to hit really hard with their great weapons, and we don't got to worry about them fleeing. They are not allowed to have lances, so they are not going to hit as hard on the initial charge as say your Rail Knights will, but they should be able to grind in combat quite well. Our Grail Knights are the same as before, radiant and awesome, just use them in the same way. Which leads us to our last and final new unit, which is the Trebuchet. This will give you a taste of how artillery works in the old world, and for that matter, the older Warhammer Fantasy editions. Give you some practice using some templates, and honestly, it's a pretty fun unit. The thing with trebuchets and artillery in general is sometimes they do nothing, and sometimes they do something absolutely crazy, so they're a fun unit to have around, especially in a more casual environment. That all being said, we are not the Empire here. We are not the dwarves. We're not bringing the strongest artillery in the game. But this trebuchet is a big enough threat that your opponent will have to address it, or at least try to address it, which should take pressure off of some of your knights. While not the most efficient 2,000 point list in the world, this is a fairly balanced and very fun list that will allow you to bring in new units at every stage of your escalation league, or even if you're just building it one stage at a time like some people do. It will hopefully also give you a taste of different types of units and how they work, so you know what you like, what you don't like. But of course, feel free to experiment things and change them to your liking. I really love illusion as a lore of magic. Other people don't. Maybe try elementalism and see where that takes you. These lists are largely just a launching point for your own list. Feel free to mix and match and change anything you want. They shouldn't be treated like they're set in stone and sacred. Obviously, there are other units in the Bretonnian Army books that I didn't use in these lists that I figure I'll talk about now. As far as faction popularity goes, Bretonnia seems to be having a little bit of a renaissance. I've always been a huge fan, but back in the day, they were a very small, very rare niche army that didn't get a lot of support from GW, and thus doesn't have the same breadth of units as, say, the Empire or the Greenskins or the Vampire counts. The units they do have are very flavorful and very cool, but because the army as a whole is so focused on cavalry, they don't always have the best role to fill. Units like the Grail Pilgrims or the Grail Reliquae, which I hope I'm pronouncing right, but honestly, who knows? But anyway, they have such niche uses, they're hard to work into a list unless you're actively trying to do it. These units are very cool though, and they are a joy to paint. You should definitely pick them up at some point if you're going to be a collector. Only to have them when you're doing a more narrative themed battle or campaign, which is probably the best way to play the old world anyways. In previous editions, you'd probably come to the conclusion that Grail Pilgrims are a better version of Men-at-Arms. They last longer, but probably aren't worth it for the points. It is harder to make that argument this edition because Men-at-Arms got such a glow up, but honestly, I don't think either of them have much of a place in a very competitive list. The Reliquae suffers much the same fate in that it is really nice for your infantry blocks, but if you're putting a lot of points into your infantry blocks, you're not going to get very far in most games. Bretonnia is the first army to get a true battle line unit new to the old world, and we got them in the form of Knights on Foot. They're very cool to look at, they're very cool scopes, they are just not worthwhile in the game. Their stat line isn't terrible per se, they just don't really fit into what you're trying to do as Bretonnia most of the time, and to be honest, the old world really favors cavalry and monsters over infantry. By all means, give them a shot, I just don't feel like they're going to have much of a place in most lists. The mounted yeomen are probably the best unit I didn't include in our escalation lists. These units on the tabletop were always pretty rare. Trust me, I know, because I was building Bretonnians before the old world came back, and these sculpts were very hard and very expensive to get a hold of. That being said, they could fill the niche role of being a screener units for your knights, so you could help dictate charges on your own terms, which in some lists you might find very helpful, or for some playstyles you might feel like you really need that. And ultimately, these are just my opinions. If you're going to collect Bretonnia anyways, there's not a wide breadth of units to collect, so you might as well collect them all, do your own experimenting, make your own lists, and you may find a way to use units that work for you that I can never imagine. And speaking of my opinion, now I'm going to get into what I see as a very competitive 2,000 point list. So if you play Warhammer Fantasy or any list building game, basically, with a competitive mindset, you want to focus on making the most efficient, that is cost effective list possible, and how to trade up. And by efficiency, I mean how do you craft a list to get the most value possible for your points. And by trade up, I mean you want to find the way to use the least amount of points or resources possible to take out or nullify your enemy's maximum amount of points possible. And this list, point-wise, in my opinion, is about as efficient as Bretonnia gets. Like before, we are very hero-heavy, and our Duke remained relatively unchanged, and that's because I already made him quite efficient and powerful. He is an expensive unit, so it's important you get the most you possibly can out of him. He needs to be charging and dishing out wounds as much as possible, but also make sure you don't forget that you have the Falcon Horn. A Falcon Horn is a great way to efficiently trade with your opponent points-wise. For only 40 of your own points, this magical item can completely ground your opponent's flying units, which they're likely to have at least a few of because dragons are so strong in this version of the game. The Damsel, the Prophetess, is similar to what we had before, but I threw on a Ruby Ring of Ruin, and that way it can perform more roles than what, say, just a buff bot, right? We still have that capability, we're still running Illusion, we can still buff our knights to be more durable, but she can also throw out a Fireball now, giving you a little bit more flexibility for not a lot of investment. Likewise, we are also investing more into this Paladin. Now, he's still not quite as strong as our Duke is, but we're giving him a few items to make him more durable, and we're throwing out tricks like the Gallant of the Duel to make him more dangerous for your opponent. Now this Paladin can issue a challenge, and the opponent must accept, which could be very dangerous for some of their more, let's say, fragile heroes. For our core units, we are ditching the men-at-arms altogether. I just don't think they're worth it when it comes straight up to efficiency. We are instead running with peasant bowmen completely. We have 3 units of 10. Each one of them kind of can act on its own, so you can split targets if you want, you could focus fire if you want. Positioning is going to be important because you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to protect these guys. But it's also, these are such small point values that, I mean, if your opponent wants to spend the time to charge one of these down with a more expensive unit, call that a win. The one thing we are losing from our men-at-arms is we now no longer have a tar pit in this list at all, and we are very vulnerable, or at least our Knights of the Realm are very vulnerable to getting trapped in tar pits themselves. And that basically means positioning is going to be very important if you try to run a list like this, and will ultimately decide whether you win or lose your matches. A lot of people like to run these Knights of the Realm even smaller. They do units of 5. Personally, I just feel more comfortable with 7. I like that I have that extra row of attack and a lance formation, and this is what works for me, but honestly, that's just my opinion. Rounding out this list, we have 2 units of Pegasus Knights. As I believe I've said before, I think the Pegasus Knights are probably the best single unit in the Bretonnian book. They're powerful, they're durable, and they're highly mobile, which should help you be able to choose your charges and choose your battles to inflict the maximum amount of damage. Running 2 sets of 5 will be a big problem for any opponent in any type of situation. So that, in a nutshell, is how I would build a competitive list. I'm not saying I'm the best in the world, and I'm not saying this list is the absolutely best in the world, but this is my crack at a competitive list, and I think this could do well in most game environments in the old world. But I do want to emphasize one more time that this list is made to be a competitive list. I don't think this would be very fun to play against in a casual environment, and it definitely wouldn't be fun to play against in a more narrative-driven environment. The old world, and really any Warhammer system, works best if you're in communication with whoever you're playing against and you both get on the same page of what you want out of the game. Do you want a competitive competition? Do you want a narrative experience? Do you just want to put some fluffy armies on the table? Having these conversations is going to be key to whether you get the most out of the system or not. So the last time I did a video like this, I did it for the vampire counts, and I spent a lot of time talking about how to source the models for each stage of the escalation army. It just doesn't make sense to me to do the same amount of detail for Bretonnians as I did with vampire counts, because this is not a legacy army. This army is currently supported by GW, and the models are relatively easy to get your hand on. Relatively. At least in my region, the United States, there's still quite a bit of issue with units actually staying in stock. I still haven't been able to get my hands on, the questing paladin on foot or the new damsel on foot, but for the most part, you should be able to get anything you want directly from GW. Currently, GW is still producing and selling the Bretonnia bundle box, which is their launch box, well, one of the 2 launch boxes for the old world. If you have any interest in using the official GW models at all, this box will take you very, very far. It has a lot of units for a nice base army and comes with little extras like a rule book, some dye, and things like the measuring sticks. Although, word to the wise, those measuring sticks are not accurate. Do not use them. The main thing they're useful for is hitting your opponent, but they're shit for measuring. If you don't want to use the official GW models, luckily enough, you're going to have a lot of options. Bretonnia is essentially Arthurian knights, cranked up to 11, which is a design space that a lot of designers have been able to get into and make their own takes. If you're looking for a print that stays true to the GW design aesthetics, you probably want to look at Highland miniatures or monstrous encounters. Highlands is probably the closest to GW that I've seen in a third-party retailer. I've said this for vampire counts, I'll say this for Bretonnia, and I'll probably end up saying it if I do other factions as well. They just aim to be really close to GW, and they make really good prints. Monstrous Encounters also does a great Bretonnian line. They seem to be more in line with Creative Assembly's take on Bretonnia. They look a lot like the Total War models from the video game. So if you really like that look, definitely look into Monstrous Encounters. For both, I probably recommend printing them at 32mm rather than 28. GW is technically what they call heroic scale, 28mm, but they've had such bad scale creep over the years, they are much closer to 32mm than they are 28. If you're looking for a slightly different aesthetic than what GW offers, you might want to look at the Lost Kingdom miniature line. You can also find them on Etsy, same with Highland, same with a few of the others. They don't blend very well. These models are definitely meant to kind of stand on their own. And rather than try to blend into the normal GW line. But if you get a full army of these sculpts, they still look very good on the tabletop. They're just different than GW. These are just some of the strongest examples out there. There's plenty of other options too. You could also look at taking knights that were made for historical games and using those as Bretonnians instead, because there is a lot of overlap there. However, most historical models are made in a true scale and they won't look really good next to Bretonnians or other Warhammer armies who are done in a more heroic scale, which means they have bigger weapons, bigger hands, and bigger heads. If you are curious at all as to how models scale up next to each other, definitely do a Google search before you buy anything. Not to toot my own horn, but I do a lot of scale comparison videos to show how different model ranges compare to GWs if you want to mix them in. So if that interests you at all, definitely check those out as well. These are, of course, just a few of the options available to you. It's not meant to be an exhaustive list. If you're looking for third-party miniatures and you want to look to see what's out there, my best advice to you would be go to the 9th Age forums, go to their version of Bretonnia, the Kingdom of Aquitaine or something like that, and look through their models page. They're going to have hundreds of pages of both GW models and alternative models. They'll talk about them, tell you where to get them. They'll make scale comparisons. It's an absolutely great resource if you're willing to bring in third-party miniatures to your armies. Unit fillers are also a great way to save money. The last video I did, I talked about vampire counts, and unit fillers are very important for vampires because they have a large hordes of infantry they gotta do. It's just the way the army is played. It's probably not as important for Bretonnia, especially if you're playing it like I like to play, where it's heavy on the knights. You're probably not going to use a lot of rank fillers. But it's definitely worth having a few lying around in case you want to do a large game, or just in case you do want to go infantry heavy and, want to have a stab at it without painting, dozens and dozens and dozens of men-at-arms. And as an almost standard medieval army, you should have a lot of options available to you. Jousting equipment I've seen used, it looks really good. Field equipment, you could do a shrine to the lady, a wounded horse is pretty cool. A wagon is pretty popular, being pulled either by horses or by oxen. The point is there's a lot of options available to you, and there's a lot of 3D printers that will fit that need that you can utilize as well. If you really want to go low effort and have it available to you, again, Highland Miniatures makes unit fillers specifically for Bretonnia that look really cool. I'm in the process of painting one up now. Super happy with the prints, super happy with the idea behind them. They're absolutely great if they are just a little bit expensive, for a unit filler anyways. On that note, I'll probably end the video. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of Warhammer, but more than anything else, I'm a huge Bretonnia fan. I love the faction, I love the aesthetic, and I really hope you find some use in these lists I help build for you. These lists I made are far from perfectly optimized. I'm sure a lot of you do things a different way or have different ideas to go about it. And if you do, please leave it in the comments. I'd love to read it, love to see what other people are doing, and you might end up helping somebody else as well, which is always good. I know this video is pretty long, but if you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. I love seeing your comments and saying how I helped you, or even if you don't like it, it's all good. It's all just very fascinating to me. So I'll leave it here, but once again, thank you.